Welcome back to Lesson 3 of Unit 4, where we're going to finish off the topic of intervals. In the last lesson, we discovered how to modify the description of intervals beyond just using numbers to describe major and minor seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. In this lesson, we're going to start by looking at fourths and fifths. Let us take, for example, the interval C to G. We can see it as a fifth, but can we label it major or minor? If we check against both the C major and C minor scales, we will find G in both. So we can't describe this interval as major or minor. And if we look at its inversion from G up to C, we'll find C in both G major and G minor scales. So, while we have a fourth, we can't describe it as a major or minor fourth either. We need a new adjective. These intervals found in both major and minor scales are called perfect. So, from C to G is a perfect fifth, and its inversion from G up to C is a perfect fourth. And we've just discovered rule number 6. The inversions of a perfect interval are also perfect. This explains why you can't have a perfect second, by the way. If you look at a C major scale and a C minor scale, the second in both is D. But if you invert a major second, what we could call a perfect second, there's no such thing as a perfect seventh, because there is a major seventh and there is a minor seventh. So seconds are never perfect. The only intervals that are perfect are fourths, fifths, and octaves. So, rule number 6, the inversions of a perfect interval are also perfect. Perfect fourths, when inverted, become perfect fifths. Perfect fifths, when inverted, become perfect fourths. But if we cannot describe fourths and fifths as major or minor, how can we describe these intervals? It is for the interval C to F sharp that we need a new word. C to F sharp has to be a fourth, C, D, E, F, but it's a semitone wider than a perfect fourth, and we can't call it major, so we need a new adjective, and the adjective musicians use is augmented. So C to F sharp is an augmented fourth. But what about this interval, C to G flat? Again, we can see that it is a fifth, C, D, E, F, G, but it's a semitone less than a perfect fifth, and we can't call it a minor fifth. We need a word meaning the opposite of augmented, and the word musicians use is diminished. C to G flat is a diminished fifth. Now for a word of warning. If you play the chord of C and F sharp, and then the chord of C and G flat, you'll know they sound the same. However, they have to be treated differently on paper. If you describe C to F sharp as a diminished fifth, or C to G flat as an augmented fourth, you will lose marks in your theory exam. You have to follow the rules. Count up the letter names as described in lesson 1 of this unit. C, D, E, F, F sharp. C, D, E, F, it's a fourth, augmented. C, D, E, F, G flat, it's a fifth, diminished fifth. Don't forget that these augmented, diminished, perfect, major and minor intervals can also be compound intervals. That is, intervals greater than an octave. So the note a compound minor sixth above C would be an A flat above the C an octave higher. And what happens if you invert a diminished or augmented interval? Let's look at C to F sharp again. It's the augmented fourth. But if we count up from F sharp to C, we get a fifth, of course, but this time it's diminished. And let's look at C to G flat. It's a diminished fifth. But if we count up from G flat to C, we get a fourth. And this time it is an augmented fourth. So, augmented intervals, when they are inverted, become diminished, and diminished intervals, when they are inverted, become augmented. So we're nearly at the end of this lesson, but I now need to point out that all intervals can be described as diminished or augmented. The most common one is the diminished seventh. If C to B is a major seventh, and C to B flat, a semitone narrower, is a minor seventh, we have an interval that could be narrowed further by one more semitone while remaining a seventh by sharpening the C, C sharp to B flat. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, it's a seventh, but it's smaller than a minor seventh, so it is a diminished seventh. And the chord C sharp, E, G, B flat is the chord of the diminished seventh. Here are the possible diminished and augmented intervals with, in italics, the name of another interval which sounds the same. You need to be aware that all but the first and last, the diminished second and the augmented seventh, could appear on the examination. How is all this assessed? Firstly, there are some multiple choice questions asking you to identify the correct description of a given interval. The answer will include major, minor, perfect, diminished, augmented, and a numeral, and possibly the word compound. Then there will be a couple of intervals where they just ask for the adjective without the numeral. In practice, when faced with those, it's a very good idea to work out the numeral as well, even if the exam doesn't ask for that information. And finally, there are a couple of drag and drop answers where you select the correct note with accidentals from a menu and drop it onto the appropriate place on a given stave. Be aware that you cannot do this on an iPad. You will need to do your theory exam on a computer with a mouse. Interestingly, given all the fuss the ABRSM makes of students learning C clefs in this grade, none of the examples on their website use the alto or tenor clef. The printable support material for this unit will give you examples of questions, including questions using alto and tenor clefs. Come back soon to Unit 5, where we will look at chords.